So there seems to be some problems with nuance in the United States and elsewhere, but particularly in the United States. And please excuse these sunglasses. It's a little bit bright, and so rather than squinting, I thought it'd be just better to wear these today. But there seems to be a problem with nuance in the United States on this issue of COVID and vaccines and vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and all of that. And it seems like there are some who say they're on the left that are having problems sort of conflating different issues together, and also false equivalencies and all that kind of stuff. And so I just wanted to talk about a few of those issues. I won't be able to cover all of it. I was going to write them down, and then I thought it's going to take me too long to write down the different points. So I'm just going to wing it and hope that I cover some of these things myself. This is just my opinion. Also, it's based on some real outcomes. And so, one of the things that a lot of people who say they're not anti-vaxxers but proceed to kind of put out a whole lot of different things that are trying to cause people hesitancy in vaccines, also to hasten up the process so that everybody will just go, let's have herd immunity and, stuff all the immunosuppressed people, the old people, the young people, in fact, all of that. They just want things to end, and so I just wanted to say that very rarely do people from that group, and this includes, a couple of journalists that I've seen, and also a comedian who have been trying to basically putting out stuff, and also stuff about ivermectin, stuff about an anti-parasitic drug also. So let's have some, let's look at a few things, and then that this will just be my input into it. I've done a couple of videos already on this. Why I'm interested in this is because it's causing this badly managed situation in the United States in particular by the government, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I think it's probably more a bit of both, has created a whole lot of suffering and death for a lot of people. 500,000 dead, I think, or 600,000 dead in the United States alone, 4.5 million people dead worldwide, and that's probably an underestimate from COVID. So the one point that very rarely do people who are, I will just call them anti-vaxxers, really. Okay, they say it's other things, but really underneath it all, I think that's what it is. So one of the things that they fail to mention when they're talking about these issues, the majority of people in ICU are not vaccinated. And so people who are doubly vaccinated usually don't end up in ICU, and those, maybe there might be one or two that have had one vaccination might end up in ICU, but the majority of people who are vaccinated don't end up in ICU. They don't end up with severe disease. Now, do these people who are vaccinated, I happen to be one who I've had both vaccinations, Pfizer. And by the way, I didn't rush to do that. I looked into it enough, and I made the choice between COVID and severe disease and possible death, and being vaccinated. And if there was any questions with those types of vaccinations, I looked into all of it, and I decided, for the sake of community and for my own health and those that I love, that I decided to get vaccinated. So I'll just put that out there. So unfortunately, and I'm not sure if it's an inconvenient truth about people being most of the people in ICU are not vaccinated. That seems like an inconvenient truth to a lot of people. Today I saw Kim Iversen. I don't consider her on the left particularly, because she puts out a lot of right-wing talking points, and she's done nothing but try and find whatever study she can to sort of poo-poo COVID, and I think that's based on the fact that her financial situation has been impacted significantly by COVID, and so she is probably trying to do something to change the narrative so that the lockdowns, etc., will end. Yes, now that's a point that vaccinations have actually dropped the number of COVID cases, but as I mentioned, it's been so badly managed in the United States that it's almost endemic at this point. So unless all states were doing the correct thing right from the get-go, and they didn't, that's why now they have so many dead, and it's so rampant everywhere. So I don't even know actually whether they could turn that around in the US at this point. I don't think so. I think it's endemic, and that is the government's fault. And on top of that, also people who refuse to get vaccinated, because that would help stop the spread to some degree, but you also would have to wear masks because people who are vaccinated also can spread it. And you would also have to have regular booster shots at this point, because there's so many variants. Why are there variants? Because a lot of people are still unvaccinated. A lot of people refuse to wear masks. A lot of people refuse to social distance. They go to these football events and they don't bother. And also, there's so many different states are doing different things, and if you don't have a coordinated thing with this particular virus, which is now very, very easily spread with the Delta variants, there's more than one variant now, then you're going to have the shit show that is the United States. So I understand to some degree why there are people now who who are tired of the lockdowns and stuff. But just remember, it's not because the lockdowns don't work. It is because your government is a shit show, and it just does whatever it feels like. It doesn't care about the people, and it only cares about corporations. So if governments are pushing for people to get vaccinated, it's not because they love you or anything. It's because businesses and capitalism is in some ways suffering from people not being vaccinated and not being able to spend a lot of money and all of that. And so that's part of it. Then there's also the case where the government the government gets lots of funding from Big Pharma. And Big Pharma, on one hand, wants to produce a good vaccine that works for people, but on the other hand, it doesn't mind. I don't think Big Pharma, as corrupt as it is, I don't think they mind whatsoever if people don't socially distance, don't wear masks, don't rush to get vaccinated, because then that means that there will be ongoing need for vaccination. Just like the flu, I don't choose to have flu shots because I take vitamin D, and I also tend to be very careful and not go out too much in sort of where you can get that kind of thing. But I recognize the need for people who are immunosuppressed or who are older people who require vaccinations for flu shots, and maybe one day I might decide to do that. But just like the flu, which has a different variant every year, there are flu vaccinations every year, and that's what will probably happen with COVID. Because governments have messed up, particularly the US government. COVID is rampant and endemic in the US, and now there'll be probably variants every year. And so it would be necessary to have booster shots. Now that fits right in with Big Pharma. They love the idea of making more money on booster shots. So the people who are refusing to wear masks, who are refusing to social distance because freedom, and who refuse to get vaccinations, are actually in many ways helping the very corporations that they say are corrupt by not going along and actually getting a vaccination. Now, I sometimes wonder if a lot of the people who used to be QAnon, and I'm not saying everybody is like this, everybody that's anti-vax is like this, but I do have to wonder whether those who are QAnon have now, because that's run its course, now they've jumped on the anti-vax train. Now, you can be for having a vaccination, and you can be against mandates, vaccination mandates and vaccination passports. I particularly don't like forcing people to do stuff, but I also recognize that there are things that have been forced on people. There's a lot of things. And one thing that is forced on people is if you're smoking, you cannot smoke in the workplace. You cannot smoke on planes or trains. You cannot smoke. You have to go right away from your workplace to smoke. And they are things that people have come into law, and people seem to do what the law says. I don't see anybody having huge protests about the rights and freedoms of people to smoke. But that is an example of something that is forced on people. And I think that's a good thing. I grew up at a time where people could smoke in cafes, could smoke on planes, could smoke everywhere, including the workplace, and that was fine. And everybody had to breathe in that secondhand smoke. And there are people later on in life developed cancer who had never smoked, and that's because of the secondhand smoke. So it took them ages and ages, but obviously the tobacco industry wasn't as powerful or convincing anymore, and the government has found other ways to make money, or other donors, and so they have basically decided now to do something about secondhand smoke. But where are the people that protested in big worldwide protests about that? That is taking away freedoms, isn't it? So, there are things that have been, because basically, just like COVID, if you're sitting around smoking, you're endangering the health of people around you because they breathe it in. And just like with COVID also, people seem to feel the need and the right to be able to spread COVID and be a part of the development of variants, mutations of the virus. Viruses naturally mutate. That's a science fact. They naturally mutate, but also if you have populations where you're completely new to the virus, like naive candidates, basically, there can be all sorts of mutations developed because people refuse to address that naive state and get a vaccination, which gives you some immunity, and then the booster shot boosts that immunity. And yes, you can, because of these variants, you can get COVID again 6 months after that. That is really unfortunate, but that is a fact. You can be doubly vaccinated. For example, I can be doubly vaccinated, as I am, and then in 6 months' time, if I come across another variant, not the original COVID, but say Delta Z, which is even more contagious than the first Delta, which is very contagious, then I can get that. Hopefully, I'm in the age group that would be considered susceptible to getting serious COVID. That's one of the reasons I got vaccinated, of course, for community too, right? Because I care about the community. I care about other people on the other side of the world too, who, by the way, the Global South is begging for patents to be dropped so they can get vaccinations. And here in the Global North, we are pushing against getting vaccinations, complaining about vaccinations and refusing to get them, refusing to wear masks and refusing to social distance and all of that, because freedom. So that says a lot, doesn't it, about the Global North and the Global South. Another racist thing, another privileged thing that we in the Global North are doing to the Global South. I'm getting off the track of my point, but this is another point that I wanted to make. So, those who claim to care about racism, to be anti-racist, to care about white supremacy, to care about white privilege, if you're kicking up against and refuse to get vaccinations, maybe find a way to help the Global South get vaccinations, because our racist Global North here or the big pharma refused to release the patents so that the Global South can get vaccinated. I know somebody in Vietnam that they really, really wish they could get vaccines and they cannot. So I've gone off that point I was making earlier, but there's another point I wanted to make about here in Tasmania. Here in Tasmania, the government initially, the state government, not the federal government couldn't care less if everybody got COVID. There's a Pentecostal Christian, in quotes, who believes in the rapture, Scott Morrison, who is running the country, and he couldn't care less. He thinks it's God's will if people die and whatever. He couldn't care less if everybody got COVID, but the states took hold of the situation here in Australia, and initially in Tasmania, we were probably one of the worst. States, and for a little while there was somebody a nurse who was travelling around to different hospitals and managed to spread COVID, and there's about 13 people died, but that was where it ended. It ended there because the state here in Tasmania decided that we should lock down. We basically are an island here, so they raised the moat. Well, they raised the drawbridge, and there's basically a moat around this state. So nobody could come in. They wouldn't allow anybody in. They stopped international flights. It wasn't as good as what China did, but it certainly was pretty good, because we haven't in Tasmania had to wear a mask since March 2020. I've got a little cat here who's very young, who's trying to bite me and is trying to get me to stop doing this so that I can play with them. So just excuse that. So anyway, it's Aoife. So anyway, that's what happened here, and you'll rarely see you'll see people citing, like Sweden. By the way, Sweden had a dreadful way of handling things. They allowed old people in aged care homes had a horrendous time. They basically left them without oxygen. They were gasping for breath, and they died in the nursing homes. That's how Sweden handled it, with their herd immunity. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to have people mask mandates or anything. Now, people may not care one iota about old people, and for you, I say shame on you, because when you start looking at people as quote-unquote useless eaters like the Nazis used to, they used to say that about people who had disabilities. When you start looking at that kind of thing where you think, oh, well, they're not contributing to the economy, who cares if they die? Which is something a little bit like what Max Blumenthal is, the journalist who doesn't seem to care about old people dying. There are other people dying as well, but he seems to it's just like he doesn't seem to care. He just wants herd immunity. So if you don't care about those things, it's a slippery slope to not caring about other groups if you consider them inconvenient to your lifestyle of being able to go into a restaurant and eat there. So I'm losing track of what I'm saying here, but the Global South really, really want vaccines, and the Global North is complaining about it. So those who say they're on the left and they don't really care about that aspect of it, and they don't really care about old people dying, and there are other age groups, all different groups are dying now or being in ICU. And if you're going to do bad faith reporting on things and just do false equivalencies, and also not mention the fact that globally, unless this is some sort of global conspiracy with every health worker in ICU, globally, vaccines keep people out of ICU, generally speaking, particularly if they're double vaccinated. The unvaxxed people are the ones in ICU. They're the ones that are dying. And the ones that are big anti-vax promoters, some of those people, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, have died in the US and in the UK. And just because it may not have affected you personally, just because you may have gotten it and didn't die from it, and now you think you're invincible, or your friends haven't gotten it, or your partner hasn't gotten it, or you haven't had your mum or your mother or father die from it, and you think therefore it's not affecting me, so fuck everything. Let's just have COVID everywhere and get used to it. The old living with COVID thing. Yes, we'll have to live with COVID because of the shit show that's happened in the US and the UK and Western countries, right? But there are ways, of course, of reducing the amount of death, reducing the load on hospitals. That's the other thing. If you have relatives in the future that want to go to hospital and there's COVID everywhere and there's COVID patients full up in ICU, filling up ICU, you're not going to be able to go to the hospital if you have an accident, if you cut your hand off, if your mother has a heart attack, if your father has a stroke, if you have an accident where you need to go to ICU, or even in just other parts of the hospital, right? You won't be able to go because freedom. You won't be able to go to the hospital. Your parents won't be able to go to the hospital. Your child will not be able to go to the hospital because the hospital and ICU will be full of COVID patients, including children. So freedom, isn't it great? Freedom for other people to die, and it's only going to be freedom for other people to die until it hits you personally, and then it'll be a problem. Freedom for the global south to die, usual racist privilege shit that we go on with here. So shame on you if you're on the left and you think that. Now, about ivermectin. Now, there was a little while there, about 7 months ago, where I was watching Dr. John Campbell. That is a very good YouTube channel, and I recommend you go and have a look at it. I don't think he has a Patreon, but he's actually presenting science, and he presents, even though he knows that talking about certain things are going to be problematic, he does it anyway, but he's not collecting money for this, okay? So it seems. But even if he was, I actually trust him at this point. I've been watching him now for the last year almost, and he's done some reports on ivermectin, right? Now, at one point, he did some discussions, he did some reports on how ivermectin was being used in India because they couldn't get vaccinations. And there were some good reports that ivermectin was actually, I know it's an antiparasitic, right? Which is really weird that it would have antiviral properties, but it appeared like ivermectin was actually working in some to keep away, to keep basically people from getting COVID, but also to reduce the symptoms and keep them from dying. Right? Now that happened, seemed to be happening about 8 months ago, and he's kept an eye on it. But I don't think that is necessarily the case now. I think that. And that was never seen as a replacement, by the way, for the vaccine. People in India were only taking that because they couldn't get the vaccine. Another example of Big Pharma being corrupt and not wanting to release patents so that people around the world could develop their own vaccines and hopefully save lives. So that was something that was happening back then. So I don't think that's the case now, right? And it was never seen as a replacement for vaccines. It was seen as something that might have had some antiviral properties that help prevent the invasion of COVID into cells. Now, whether that's happening or not now, I don't think it is, right? I don't think it's working on the variants, but I haven't really looked into that. Okay, so if I haven't really looked into it much, because I think now it's gotten to the point where there's so many variants now, it's not really very effective, if it ever was, right? But I'm not the type of person that's going to pretend something isn't working or hasn't worked or is complete nonsense. Like I don't call it a horse antiparasitic, because I mean, people, if they take the dosage that you would give a horse, that's really silly of them. Horses weigh a lot more than humans, and there is a milligrams for people for ivermectin, which is an antiparasitic, is I think 18 milligrams twice a week for the first week, and then you take 1 every week from then on. That's how it was supposed to be if you were going to take that for something, right? For something like this COVID thing. But I'm not going to poo-poo the fact that ivermectin at one point looked like it might have some promise to prevent some COVID, because people couldn't get vaccines. If I thought that in the global south, if people could take ivermectin instead of a vaccine because they couldn't get a vaccine, I would be talking. I was mentioning it at the time many months ago when I thought it looked like it was promising, because I don't want anybody to get this awful disease. I don't want to get it, and I also don't want many variants to happen. And I mentioned variants happen, mutations happen naturally with a virus. That's a natural thing. But when you have a lot of people that are susceptible to getting it because it's completely new, then you're going to get more and more mutations. So that's why it's important that people get the vaccine, so that the mutations don't come ad infinitum and they get worse and worse till maybe one day there isn't any vaccine that will stop it. Who knows? But we can thank all the people in the US that have decided freedom and mistrust their government, and they have the right to mistrust their government, and they mistrust Big Pharma, and they have the right to trust Big Pharma. But two things can be true at the same time. COVID can be real, and it is real. Vaccines can work even if Big Pharma is corrupt. mRNA vaccines are not new. They've been around for about 20 to 30 years. Vaccines keep people, generally speaking, if you're double vaccinated, it's been able to keep people out of ICU. Most people that are in ICU are unvaxxed. But vaccines, because of all the variants, basically aren't going to address the new variants that are coming out, because just like the flu, every year there's going to be more different variants, and that's why they have yearly flu vaccines. So, and also like in Israel, people got vaccinated really early there. Unfortunately, they practiced medical apartheid and didn't get the Palestinians vaccinated, and were trying to palm off expired COVID vaccines on them. But that's for another story. That's apartheid Israel. But most Israelis got vaccinated, and that's been over 6 months, and now there's other variants, and that's why they are now catching the variants and getting disease from it, even though they've been double vaccinated, right? That doesn't mean that the vaccines don't work. It just means that the vaccines aren't very successful against new variants. And I've said why there's new variants. And part of that majorly is because people refuse to get vaccines, even though it's offered for free. And so, there are going to be more and more variants. So yes, that's what's happened in Israel. They got, it only lasts the immunity or the protection against it for 6 months now. And that people are going to need boosters. Now, how often are people going to need boosters? I think it seems like it might be yearly, and if people just stop with the freedom business and stop with the allowing their mistrust of government to get in the way of doing what is probably a good thing to do, and not allowing Big Pharma's corruption and Big Pharma probably wanting this to go on ad infinitum. Well, those who have refused to do the vaccinations, refused to do masking, voluntarily refused to do social distancing, have just assisted in, firstly, Big Pharma cleaning up at the bank, right? And will continue to clean up in the bank. And you've assisted governments from being able to screw poor people once again, and black people. Black people are 3 times more likely to get COVID and die from COVID. So those who are going freedom, or who are inconvenienced and want to go inside restaurants, like a couple of white journalists I've seen, or who financially impacted and just kind of think, fuck everything, I'm going to keep putting out this narrative till we just let COVID go everywhere so I can get back to earning my Patreon dollars and whatever. And I understand that to some extent, why people are worried about their finances, of course. But, the thing is, everybody who's trying to push back on vaccines are basically cutting their own they're cutting their nose off to spite their face, so to speak. They're shooting themselves in the face because they're actually keeping it going longer. Those who have been pushing against doing what would have been a good community thing to do are now finding that it's going to go on and on and on, and they'll be you'll have to get vaccinations, booster shots now, and the government will probably try and force people to do it. And I'm not really into forcing people to do it. I'd rather people voluntarily want to help community, like used to be. People used to be a lot more community minded until neoliberalism, and more and more governments have become corrupt and everything. And now those who have an authority problem want to push back on anything that the government says, except when it's convenient, basically. When it's convenient for the government cracking down on, say, the left, that's totally fine, isn't it? When it's inconvenient, when it's interfering with going to your favorite restaurant, or just because it's the Biden government and not the Trump government or whatever, then whatever. It's just it's totally compartmentalized, and that's what makes it disingenuous. That's what makes it bad faith. So I'm all over, as usual, I'm all over the place here. I wish I had enough time to sit down and write this point by point. But, you know, there are things that can be true all at once. There can be things like COVID being real, vaccinations keeping people out of ICU, Big Pharma being corrupt, government being corrupt, government taking away people's, government cleaning up by letting COVID run rampant, not, you know, all the states being doing different things and letting COVID run rampant so that the government who was in the pockets, governments in the pockets of corporations can basically buy out people's homes, you know, when they have to default on mortgages because the government won't manage things properly. They won't do real eviction bans and really support the people financially. You know, governments can help corporations clean up and buy up homes and stuff. So when people don't cooperate in a communal sense by doing all the masking and the social distancing and maybe getting vaccines, even if you hate Big Pharma, I don't like Big Pharma, right? But even if you did all those things, you'd find, and if governments had, if they weren't in the pockets of capital, if they weren't in the pockets of corporations and stuff, and they weren't capitalists, they would do what, say, for example, Vietnam has done, which is basically lock down people and has managed up until recently. They're not doing very well at the moment, but they try to do things for the people, because they're not all about their economy, they're about people in Vietnam. The Americans didn't manage to stamp out communism in Vietnam, and that is working well, the fact that people aren't full-on capitalists in Vietnam, and so they're able to do things for people instead of for corporations, and that's what's the difference between Vietnam and the United States. So anyway, this is sort of all over the place, and the reason I'm doing this again, the reason I'm focusing on this issue about COVID is because I can see the Global South is desperate for vaccinations. They don't want hundreds of thousands, millions of people to die. They want to see the end of the variants, which are just going to keep coming because capitalist countries don't give a shit about people. They think they can take away a lot of freedoms, as they do with any disaster. They can take away a lot of property, as with any disaster. You know, look what they did in New Orleans with the first Katrina hurricane. They managed to gentrify areas. They use disasters to increase surveillance, to increase government oppression, to increase stealing and plundering from the poor and gentrifying. And that's what they're doing with this COVID thing. But they also, if corporations are suffering, if capitalism, the capitalist class is suffering because of COVID, then they'll start to push back, you know, push things, measures that keep people healthier so that they can spend money. You know, there are things that are true, and there are things that can happen simultaneously, where the motivation for governments wanting people to be vaccinated isn't about because they care about people, is because their corporate overlords have told them, well, we're suffering at the moment, we're not getting people spending as much money, and so we want people to be vaccinated, so they can spend money, so that they can get back to work, and also they can use this COVID thing to make people even poorer, so they'll be desperate for work and they'll do any sort of work for any kind of money. That's exactly the kind of thing that corporations want. They want almost slave labor. So there are things that work and Big Pharma cleans up because people have refused to do what was required in the beginning, and governments have refused to do, state governments have refused to do what was required. And so now they have ongoing money train of booster shots. And COVID multiplying, mutating ongoing like the flu. So they've got a money train, so they're happy, but they needed a good product in the beginning, and the vaccines worked. Then there are people who want to say that vaccines, there's all these vaccine injured people. Compared to, there's actually people that have had temporary side effects, and there's some people who have died, very few, but some who have died from the AstraZeneca, But overall, there's been a lot more people die from COVID, 4.5+ million. There's been a lot of people suffering, still ongoing long haul COVID, which is hideous. There are children now going into ICU and into hospital, like thousands, right? There are immunosuppressed people now that are almost like prisoners in their own home because COVID is everywhere, and even and the vaccines only work for so long because mutations, because people freedom, right? there are people now that are prisoners in their own home almost because of people being selfish and not doing what was required in the beginning, because they have an authority figure problem and because they don't trust their government. I get it, right? But still, you can have two things happening at the same time. You can have a government you don't trust, and you can have a vaccine that keeps people out of ICU, and a vaccine that may stop continuing on, like reducing the amount of people getting COVID and the reduction of mutations. So if one is able to have nuanced thoughts, you can sort of weigh up things and think which is the better thing to do. The better thing to do in the beginning was governments locking down immediately, like what happened here in Tasmania. It wasn't good right from the beginning, but after that it was. Locking down, getting people to wear masks, getting people to social distance, providing incentives. Oh, they didn't have to provide incentives for people to get vaccinations, but I think it would have been a good idea. In fact, the federal opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, said it might be a good idea to offer $300 to each person to get vaccinated. But he's not in government, right? He's not the Prime Minister of Australia. Scott Morrison, who is a right-wing Pentecostal Christian who believes in the rapture and doesn't give a toss about the population, would have just let COVID go everywhere, as I said, but the states decided to do something. Although now New South Wales is obviously getting pressure from the federal government and is wanting to only have 70% people vaxxed before they open up, which will mean that there'll be millions of people who are unvaxxed who will end up probably going to hospital. The hospitals will be overwhelmed with people who have COVID, and other people who don't have COVID and had accidents or who have other reasons to go to hospital won't be able to get into those hospitals, won't be able to go to ICU. So this is the problem with capitalism. This is the problem with countries that are capitalists who care more about the economy and don't use the sovereign economy the way it should be used. Learn MMT. This is the problem with capitalist countries. They don't function like Vietnam, whose government cares about the people and literally stopped all, literally shut down a lot of things, even though that hurt them financially, so they could get this disease under control. They still are trying to get vaccinations. They're trying to develop their own vaccine. But the Global North won't let them have the patents, won't let other Global South people have the patents, and therefore we're going to have more people die in the Global South, and we're going to have more variants, and that's the shit show that capitalism brings to the world. And that's why it has to end. That's why if we're on the real left, we need to be anti-capitalist. We need to be anti-imperialist. That's the other thing. The Western countries, the Western governments who are all imperialist, allies of the U.S. empire, they're quite happy for a lot of countries to be ravaged by COVID, because that means there's a kind of a depopulation of those countries. There's also, it's weakened, so they can go in there and invade, or go in there and take over, or go in there and offer huge loans through these awful, like the IMF and that kind of thing. So countries become impoverished, and they have to pay back these dreadful loans. Western capitalist imperialist governments in this patriarchal society are more than happy if COVID ravages the Global South. It's a racist, white supremacist thing. So, there are all these aspects that people who, particularly, I'm kind of appalled and disappointed in the way, I have to say it, Jimmy Dore, even though I find he's very beneficial with a lot of anti-imperialist stuff, he's on his show today going on about ivermectin. Has he really actually looked into it? And he's never stopped talking about the difficulties he had after he had his vaccination. But if you've ever paid attention to the Jimmy Dore show, he often has aches and pains and problems with his health way before the vaccination, way before the vaccines. He constantly carries on about how he's got aches and pains. So he's not very healthy. Then he has a vaccine, and who knows if any of that is coming. He's okay now, but who knows if any of that is coming from actual vaccines, because that's not the common report. I had vaccine twice, and I had a sort of some small and barely significant side effects from that. That's the immune system that is causing those symptoms. It's not the vaccine, but the immune system responding to that, so that we have some sort of defense against a very, very new virus and the variants. And the variants, they're going to tweak those different boosters so that people have some resilience against the variants of the vaccine. The variants of COVID, the original COVID is not the same now. There's variants, and they're a lot more contagious. And, so they're always, unfortunately, because it wasn't managed properly in the West, the whole world now has to suffer. The whole world has to probably have booster shots, and Big Pharma is going to clean up. So all those people with the freedom and all of that, and complaining endlessly about the side effects of the vaccines, even though it's probably Jimmy Dore's own problems before the vaccines, that this is what he's complaining about. And, Max Blumenthal now, any sort of non-scientific thing, it's science-free, fact-free, false equivalency and all of that when he reports on things. He doesn't use his journalism skills at all when it comes to talking about COVID and the vaccines. And he's conflating the problems with forcing vaccines on people, the mandates and the vaccine passports, which I'm against, because it can exclude a whole bunch of people, Muslims, poor people, black people, people of color, from coming into the country or from doing things in the country, from going to various things. I'm against all that. I'm for incentives. But Max Blumenthal has used all this conflated together, including, corrupt individuals in government, corrupt individuals in Big Pharma and all of that. He's conflated all of that to try and push this thing of herd immunity, so that, who cares if immunosuppressed people die? Who cares if immunosuppressed children die? Who cares if old people die? Yada, yada, yada. Who cares if the global south has to deal with our fucking variants forever and a day? He doesn't care because he can't go into a restaurant. He might not be able to go into his favorite restaurant. Or who knows, maybe the grey zone is suffering financially and he wants it to end. But what a fucking selfish thing for us to be doing when the global south is begging for patents to be dropped. They're begging for vaccines, and this is the fucking shit show we have in the West, in the global north. It just disgusts me. The whole fucking white supremacist, patriarchal, racist bullshit that we do when it's convenient, and the rest of the time we're complaining about the racist white supremacist stuff. It's just when it's inconvenient, we're okay with all of that. We're okay with the capitalism. We're okay with everything. We're okay with the results of where we've actually helped Big Pharma and government cause a shit show because we're inconvenienced a bit. And yes, I think everybody should be sort of do their research and stuff, but have some nuance, for fuck's sake. Have the ability to see a few things happening at the same time and picking and choosing which is the best thing to do. And ultimately, it should all be about community. If we didn't have this fucking neoliberalism nightmare that we have, if we didn't have selfish people, all USA, 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 fuck everything, fuck the government, I'm not going to do what anybody says because freedom and all this freedom to spread fucking death around because I'm a little inconvenienced or because I have authority issues. There's a whole bunch of things can be true at the same time. Government can be corrupt. Big Pharma can be corrupt. Big Pharma can produce vaccines that actually work because they want to make money. Big Pharma can want COVID to go on and on and on because they'll rake in the profits. If vaccine passports, can be a racist thing to exclude people. Vaccine mandates is probably not a great idea in the United States because people have such a problem with authority and stuff like that. They should have done incentives, but they're so fucking stingy as a government, and they never use the sovereign economy to benefit the people. They could have offered everybody a certain amount of money to get vaccines, and they could have locked down immediately, and they could have had people wearing masks and social distancing because there was some level of trust in what the government was doing. But instead, because the government is a shit show and it has been for a long time and doesn't care about the people and is run by corporations, this is the kind of thing. And also that there's a deeply uneducated and ignorant, there's a lot of people, sadly, and I don't mean this to sound rude, but there are a lot of deeply uneducated people in the United States, and that's the sort of response that you get when you have a public that has been abandoned for many, many, many decades, and where the government has not supported the people like they should have done for a very long time. You get this quote-unquote dog-eat-dog situation where people don't give a shit about each other. It's all about I got mine, fuck you. Or I don't care about people overseas, what the fuck, they're irrelevant. They're only good for pillaging their countries, imperializing them and getting resources from them. Imperialism is good. USA, 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 USA. They don't care about other countries because it brings their wars bring in resources into their own country, and they want to conquer and be the greatest hegemons in the history of the planet. This is what happens when you have you have a country that is based on white supremacy. Every Western country's got that problem. We've got that problem here. The genocide of indigenous people here. And capitalism. Capitalism is an absolute scourge It's a scourge. It's a tumorous scourge that is eating up anything that is good. But this is the shit show we have here. A number of things can all be happening at the same time, nuanced. And this is the problem. We get people acting in bad faith, trying to make out like there isn't all these nuanced things happening, and trying to cherry pick and put out science-free things, science-free reports, all because they want to go and eat in their favorite restaurant. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. So there's other things I could say. There's other things I could say about this, but I mean, you get the idea. You get that I'm not happy with this, because now we have to live with this fucking thing on top of, and by the way, while all this is going on, people are so taken up with COVID and the terrible financial crisis it causes, the terrible suffering and all of that. Meanwhile, while that's happening, the earth is burning. So we're on the edge of extinction, and this is another thing. Who knows? Conspiracy theories, a lot of conspiracy theories turn out to be true, and we'll never know with DARPA and the US government, and how the US government wants to conquer the world. Basically, the US empire wants to conquer the world by any means necessary, and they wanted China to be a target. They've been trying to make China a target for a long time in the crosshairs. Who fucking knows what happened, how COVID came about? It's a zoonotic disease, and that's why one of the many, many reasons we need to go vegan. That's another thing people just ignore, that it's a zoonotic disease. But it also could have been, who knows? And you don't know. Who knows? It could have been released in China because they wanted to disable China financially, and because China is partly capitalist, partly communist. It does things to the people. It's gotten 800 million people out of poverty. It does things for the people. And so they basically did all the right things and locked down. But who knows if who knows if the CIA released COVID into that country when there was a bunch of soldiers came there during near Wuhan. Who knows what happened there? Who knows because that's the CIA. That's what they do. They go around causing chaos. They're the invisible army of capitalism. Read Doug Valentine's book about that. Who knows what? I wouldn't put anything past the US empire and the CIA at this point, because when you see their history and how many governments they've interfered with and overthrown and they've literally, look at the beginning of the US, the country, how they introduced smallpox into the indigenous population to kill them off. Look at testing syphilis on black people. Look at the slavery and all of that. Look at the way the country started, and all that CIA has done too in recent decades since it was formed, overthrowing 50 plus governments, 60 plus countries and governments and democratically elected governments, and is continuing on. And now China is in the crosshairs. Why wouldn't they want to fucking meddle with China? Why wouldn't they want to, if they could, introduce a very, very serious illness, disease, a virus into that population to try and decimate the population, to try and cause economic struggling with China? Because China is going to be one of the greatest, the top economic power in the world, and so soon in the next 10 years, and the US knows that. And all these governments serve corporations. They're the capitalist class. They serve the capitalist class. Of course they don't want China to take over. So why wouldn't the CIA or some nefarious means to introduce a virus into that country to try and destroy them economically? And it backfired. But did it backfire? Because now there's bunches of corporations cleaning up in the United States. So it may have been a coincidence. All these different things happen that benefit corporations, but you always know that corporations are going to come out on top, because that's what capitalism is all about. So the corporations have cleaned up in the United States, and there are black people that are also dying by times 3. There's all sorts of things. They can use the vaccine mandates to exclude people, exclude minority groups, poor people from different things. There's a whole bunch of benefits for capitalism and corporations since COVID. Who knows what happened there? Who knows? It might have been just a zoonotic disease that, which was around before even China. It's been in the sewer systems of I think Brazil, before it broke out in China. Where has that narrative gone? So who knows? But it's a zoonotic disease ultimately, and that's why we need to go vegan. many reasons, and that's just one of many reasons to go vegan. Anyway, I've talked a long time. I hope I made some sense there. There's a lot of other things I could say about this, but I'd have to have written a list. I don't think I covered anywhere near as much as I wanted to cover. But thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Think about getting a vaccine. Yes, there can be problems with vaccines. Who knows? Down the track, maybe there might be. But dying from COVID, think about all the things I've talked about in here, and maybe choose to think about the global south and how they're going to be ultimately the ones that suffer the most if mutations by mutations keep happening. And think about your relatives and stuff, because eventually, and your partners and your children, because eventually everybody is going to be affected as these mutations get more and more, because people just refuse to do anything to stop them, refuse to get vaccinated and whatever, refuse to wear masks and all of that. Of course, taking civil liberties away from people because they can have the excuse, of vaccine passports and stuff, you see? And so all these people have been pushing against all of this doing the right thing in the beginning, and governments not doing the right thing. It's all contributed now to more clampdowns on people, to more dying of people in the global south, to more suffering and death. So ultimately, these people that are all freedom, have helped develop this shit show that's happening right now.